So I can really relate to this idea of like family genealogy, and you discover like, is there this scandal or whatever? Because my
Mhm.
family is very into genealogy and there are many different scandals that I'm like, I want to research that. So at what point did you come to this story inspired to write with a modern narrator, bringing the modern gaze onto the historical, or did
Mm.
you kind of find that as you were writing because you were already were interested in this period?
So it was weird when I was really I was very contemporary brained because I love historicals, but I was very intimidated by writing a historical. And so originally, what I was going to do was, this book is inspired by a real life vaudeville troupe called Billy Watson's Beef Trust, which was a group of dancers all over 200 pounds. And I was like, that's such a cool entry point for a story. But again, historicals were scary. So I was like, not going to do that. So the idea was originally, it was going to be almost like Julie and Julia, the book about like the woman who does all the Julia Child recipes. And so it was going to be a modern day kind of romantic coming of age story about a woman who does like burlesque classes through the lens of this Billy Watson Beef Trust. And then like around the same time as I had that idea, a lot of people were writing sort of contemporary growing into your own self-confidence narratives. And as like a plus size woman, I was just sort of like, I don't know if I think we've had enough of those. I think, and I didn't know of a way to crack it that felt unique and like really relevant and important in this current. So then I was like, you know what? It's time. We're going to do the historical thing, and that's just going to be what it is. And if it fails, then you failed and you're in the same place you are right now. So maybe you'll succeed. Who knows? And so I started to write the historical narrative. And what ended up happening was as I was researching, I just realized that a lot of what we have been taught about these historical time periods is extremely conservative, extremely white, extremely heteronormative, totally ignores the contributions of disabled people and the queer community, and certainly people of color. And this particular moment of history was an inflection point where we had kind of a liberalizing force, and vaudeville was a huge part of that because then you had these very diverse performers who traveled the country and brought new ideas to these smaller American communities. And then the backlash to that came with these very regressive newspaper interests who then turned their power against these marginalized communities. And what I had found when I was kind of coming up as a historical romance reader, like I first fell in love with historical romance through like Alyssa Cole's books, for example, like An Extraordinary Union. And what I found they really came up against, Vanessa Riley's had this, Piper Hewley's had this, Courtney Milan, like they have all talked very candidly about how readers will contact them and be like, your happily ever after is impossible. It's not historically accurate. Your books are, historical fantasy, basically. And no matter how much they would correct the record and be like, no, here are my sources. Here's a huge blog post about where I got this history from, people would still just contend with them and say, this isn't real, this isn't right, because they have a conception of history rather than a truth of history. And so, one of my favorite expressions is some philosophical problems or debates should be dissolved rather than resolved. And so when you realize that people who have these historical blind spots, there is nothing you can say to convince them that this is the truth. They don't want the truth, they want the narrative. And so what I decided was I actually don't care if you believe it's historically accurate, but someone is going to tell you it's historically accurate. And so what I did was I invented Phoebe as an authority figure who comes in and says, like, these are the historical facts, this is the historical record, and here's how I'm fictionalizing it. I wanted a book that contended with both aspects of that debate and ultimately comes on the side of I don't care. I don't care what you think about the history or how I present it because I am also developing my own narrative, right? If progressive forces can do it, then so can I. And mine is going to be closer to the truth. But it's also going to be a celebration of joy and of community and solidarity and fighting to move our culture and society forward.
Yeah. Well, it also sounds like since she decides to give them a happily ever after, she also represents the part that kind of gets left out in those like quote unquote debates,
Mm,
which is that none of us are writing nonfiction.
yes.
We are all writing fiction. And so, yes, it is fantasy. Fantasy meaning we are all inventing this. And so, some of it is more pulled from true history, and some of it is more pulled from genre history, and some of it
Mm,
is just pulled from our, if you want to talk about a collective consciousness or a muse or whatever,
mm,
like we're allowed to write whatever we want in our books. And you can enjoy
exactly.
them, whether they're historically accurate or not.
Exactly.